and we'll just hang out for a second while everybody joins. Good afternoon, if you're joining us. We're just taking a moment and let everybody jump into our presentation here today as everybody's logging in. And we'll get started in just a second. Numbers are climbing. All right, so as folks are getting in here, want to just pause for a second, talk a little bit of housekeeping, but good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our digital version of our Elevate Career Series, Elevate Career Hacks Online. We have a great set of panelists and experts with us today who are going to work to help us understand a little bit more of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items for us. Everybody is muted, so if you do have questions and you'd like to speak to the panel, please feel free to do so by using the Q&A option on your toolbars. Second, the chat function is open as well, so please remember, if you are going to enter something into that this is a safe space and that we ask that you please be cognizant of others before you do so. Be cognizant of their beliefs, their identities as well when you're entering your comments. If you have any technical challenges, we have 3 alumni staff members here present today that will be willing to help you and assist in the ways that we can. Speaking of the alumni staff, I'd like to give a thank you and shout out to my 2 wonderful colleagues who are joining us today, who've worked tirelessly with me on this program and the other Career Hacks events that you have seen over the past 7 months. So thank you to Elisa Kelly, our Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as Kate Krause, our Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. And back to today. Our hope today is that you can gain a better understanding of how, wherever you might be within your work career, or wherever level that you might be, that you can have an impact and that you can help to make an impact on the work and the environment and climate and culture that you are in to become more accepting and more supportive. This is certainly not an easy thing and often one that comes from a lot of uncomfortable conversations. But our panelists today are here to help you take step 1 to building the muscle necessary that you would need to be thinking differently about being agents of change, to be leaders within your communities and your circles of influence. And we hope that you too will take some time to be reflective today, be honest and open about your own self-awareness and your own identities, your own biases, and your own perspectives, and where you too can work to improve and help bring about a positive change. So that's our goal for today. And joining us are, as I mentioned earlier, are some fantastic alumni who are working in various fields of diversity, equity, and inclusion. First, joining us is Bill BOERNER, Assistant Vice President of Title IX Programs and Compliance with Hobart and William Smith Colleges. We have Michael Munoz joining us from Google. He is a diversity partner, as well as Stephanie Santos, our Assistant Professor in Residence in Biomedical Engineering, and Associate Director of Engineering, Diversity, and Outreach here at UConn. And Stephanie, you're our moderator today, so thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you to lead this discussion. So thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Josh, so much. Hey, UConn family. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're joining us with your lunch, don't worry, eat away. If you have a morning coffee, enjoy that as well. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Just to make sure you have the chat going, if you could, just make sure you select 2 panelists and attendees, if you have that option, or just panelists, and let us know where you're joining us in the world from. So we're making sure you're awake and that you haven't walked away just yet. Let us know where you're joining us from. Beautiful. Abby, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, and if not, deep apologies. Thanks for tuning in from Dallas, Texas, Ithaca, New York, Bridgeport, DC, Georgia, Florida. Hey, Luke. Stamford, Connecticut, Cassie. Hey, beautiful. We've got a lot here. Wow, so much. Karen from Millis, Massachusetts. Lots from Manchester. Samantha, power to you, working from home in Lebanon, Connecticut. Oh, hi. Oh, beautiful. Farmington, Plainville. This is really beautiful to see, and continue to drop things into the chat as we continue. Hey, Jody from Glastonbury. Welcome, everyone. Welcome in. So as you come up with questions throughout or thoughts, you can, as you've done, drop those into the chat, or specifically questions, you can put that into the Q&A feature as well. So we did receive a beautiful introduction from Josh, but I'm going to dive in just a little bit deeper. So as the intro said, my name is Dr. Stephanie Santos. I recently finished my PhD in biomedical engineering, and I should say, excuse me, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm just excited to continue to be a part of the UConn family. I do have degrees. My bachelor's degree is from UConn, my master's is from UConn, and my PhD too. So UConn's taken real good care of me throughout the years, and I'm happy to continue to give back in my current roles. So I'm gonna pass the torch to, let's see, who do I wanna give it to? I'm gonna give it to Bill to continue to dive in deeper to an introduction.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be a participant today. My name is Dr. Bill BOERNER, he, him, his. My pleasure to be here. I want to do a little shout out to some of our residential life friends and student affairs folks. I worked at UConn for 4 years in residential life, lived in 4 different residential areas, and got my master's degree in student affairs administration through the HESA program. And so I'm really jazzed to participate now as an alum, and I'm excited to be here. I have had an interesting career path, mostly in student affairs administration, and had a wonderful opportunity to take on some work in our DE&I world, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer and Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the State University of New York at Fredonia. Started in that role in 2013 and had 6 years in that capacity. I also served as the Title IX Coordinator, Affirmative Action Officer, and ADA Compliance Officer in that capacity as well. Wonderful, unique opportunity, and allowed me to continue to grow and explore this career path, and now find myself at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, a really unique private liberal arts institution. It has one of the only types of institutions in the nation that has a program of 2 distinct colleges that are kind of combined in one. And so you'll hear Hobart and William Smith Colleges. That S is not a mistake. It's a coordinate system. And I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Title IX Programs and Compliance. Title IX is a really unique world right now around gender discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence. And it's definitely a lot of scrutiny and a lot of work. And so I'm really excited to be here, share some of my insights as a CDO, and share some of my insights now exclusively in this Title IX world.
Bill, thanks so much. And I do see in the chat from Carl, you've got a fellow attendee from Hobart and William Smith Colleges, plural.
That's great. Hi, Carl.
Amazing. Hey, Michael. I'm going to pass the torch to you.
Hey there, how are you? Congratulations on your doctorate. That's awesome. Gotta celebrate everything we can right now, and really great accomplishment for you. And thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Really excited to take part in this conversation. I'm a Husky through and through. I don't have my doctorate yet. From UConn, maybe somewhere down the line, I don't know, probably not. Actually, no, I'm not going back to school. I have my master's and I'm all set. But I did go to UConn undergrad, and I knew very early on that I wanted to work in diversity. Before it was diversity, equity, and inclusion, I was just D&I. And so I got my undergrad degree from UConn in Human Development Family Studies, and I was very fortunate enough to work with a dean there who helped me really explore diversity and inclusion as an option during undergrad. And so I've been very fortunate. I got into the D&I work right when I graduated in 2001. And I've had an opportunity to work in corporate environments ever since. I started my career blending my 2 passions for diversity and inclusion in sports when I started at ESPN in 2003, and worked there for a number of years, and really been very fortunate to have a career the entire time in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And no shade to anybody that's kind of come into the D&I world. We welcome you. I'm happy to have everyone. I love all the passion that's being brought into this field. And it's something that I've known since I was 16 that I wanted to do. And so I've had the perspective of working for ESPN and for Ernst & Young, Aetna, and now Mass Mutual, I can't leave them out. And now I'm at Google, where I actually transitioned yesterday into a new role where I'm the global lead for diversity, equity, and inclusion for Google's marketing arm, leading our efforts for to increase representation internally, but also using our influence in the industry to shape the way that agencies and other in-house creative marketing organizations think about creating greater equity in their marketing campaigns. So really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michael. And you kind of did segue really nicely about when you said you've been in this role for a while, but no shade to anyone just coming in. Absolutely. And we do want to actually get a better sense of who is joining us today. So if Josh could cue our first question, and I would love to know, or we would love to know, where you are in your current career. So are you early career? Are you intermediate, mid-career? You should see a poll pop up on your screen there. So if you can go ahead and vote to let us know. We'll give you 30 seconds or so to submit your vote. So hopefully you see that pop-up window. And if not, please let us know in the chat.
It is on the screen. Hopefully folks can see that. People are jumping in. We're around 80% participated. A couple more seconds.
Thanks, Josh. I can't see how many have participated, so I'm going to let you cue when it's done.
All right. Hopefully it's showing up on the screens now, but we have 35% have indicated early career, 0 to 10 years post-graduation. 9% have indicated intermediate, 10 to 15 years post-graduation. 24% have indicated mid-career, 15 to 25 years. And senior career listed at 25 to 40 years, 22%. We have 6% indicating retired, so I'm guessing they've stopped counting. And student, we are at 4%.
Amazing. And this is actually a beautiful mix. I really like that we have a broad spectrum of folks, and shout out to those who are retired joining in. You don't have to be here, but you are. So kudos to you for tuning in. Awesome. Now, the next question that we'd like to know, and again, if you're joining us a little bit late, Josh said this beautifully in the beginning, but we do want to reiterate that this is a safe space, and it's also a brave space. So please feel free to be who you are and to tell your truth and to tell your story and your experiences. We do value that. So let us know, if you could, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well does your current organization support or foster your sense of belonging? And I'm going to clarify here. I believe 1 is not well and 5 is excellent, or very well, or top tier, if you will.
All right, that is on screen as well. And we'll give another few seconds. We're at around 70% participated. Just a couple more seconds, folks. All right, going to share those results. Looking at 2% have indicated 1, 10% have indicated 2, 28% indicated 3, 46% indicated 4, and 14% have indicated 5.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm curious if Bill or Michael, do any of you have reactions to those? It seems that you've got, if I'm remembering the stats, I should have written them down, about 50% that are 4 or 5, and then 50% that are 3 or below, if I'm remembering correctly.
46% at 4, 14% at 5.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, I'm not surprised actually at that. And I know our identities span such a huge continuum of very different things. Maybe some pieces like being a parent or a geek or something like that might be part of your identity, or maybe part of, you know, your racial identity or socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, religion, things of that nature. And so I can only imagine then the depth and breadth of that, and how then does your workplace help you feel as though you can bring your whole self to that? We know that research indicates that most people don't feel comfortable bringing their whole self to the workplace. And that sense of belonging is one of the major reasons why people leave, particularly something that we're paying attention to a lot in the higher ed community. Why are individuals who are coming with diverse backgrounds to our institution, why are they perhaps leaving? Most of the time, it's not because of the job, the salary, the benefits. It's because they perhaps never found a sense of community, a sense of belonging. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah. You, Michael? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think of two things. One of them is it really relates to our employee engagement survey that we run, which asks two separate questions. And I think Googlers, as we call folks that work at Google, are really good at discerning the difference between our questions. And so one of the questions asks, how well do you feel like that Google creates a sense of belonging for you? And when we look at the results of that, they're usually very positive. They trend in the 4 to 5. We don't use 4 to 5, but 5-point scale, but they'd be in about the 4 to 5 range. But when we ask the second question, which is how well does Google create a sense of belonging for all people? Meaning, how does it make sure that everybody feels like there's a sense of belonging, that everybody, that sense of belonging is normative for everyone? We see a stark contrast in that score. And so one of the questions that I ask individuals often is that true for everyone? And what is the culture in your school or in your corporation? What are they doing to ensure that everybody is included and everybody has that same sense of belonging, and make sure that it's equitably felt across different groups, and especially across intersectional groups? The second thing that I think about is how much of a conscious decision it has been for you to go to a place where you have that sense of belonging, and kind of the power and privilege that many of us have to make those decisions. I joined Google because I wanted to go to a place where I felt like I could come and bring my full self. And for the most part, that's been really true. I haven't always felt that, but I think, when we think about the latitude and the kind of the privilege in some places that having a UConn education affords us to go to different spaces where we do feel a sense of belonging, it's one that not everybody has, and it's something that I'm really conscious of, and I think I'd ask that we all be a little bit more conscious of as we think about navigating this space.
Yeah, can I just jump in one more quick thing, Michael? I'm glad that you brought up the engagement surveys. One of the best questions I ever recall seeing on one of those was, who's your best friend at work? Or do you have a best friend at work? And it was an engagement survey, and I remember taking it and thinking, wow, I don't have someone at work who's my best friend who I'm dying to talk to about what I did this weekend, or excited to share this new thing. And that contributed to my level of engagement and commitment to that work, that organization, and that my sense of belonging. So it's really connected in so many different ways.
I love that. And I think we can take advantage here of the technology in the chat. And I'm wondering if we could ask folks who are here to elaborate. So your first point, Michael, is that true for everyone? So for example, I'll give you the wording again. How well does your organization support or foster, I'm going to clarify here, everyone's sense of belonging? And if you could respond in the chat, either with a short yes or no, or you can elaborate a little bit more, but let us know that second piece of how well does your company or organization, and you can keep it anonymous if you'd like. You don't need to name drop your company or organization, if you could do that in the chat. And I do see Abby saying, since the new CEO took over, there have been more D&I discussions. And I think that might be true for a lot of companies and organizations. I hear some of my friends or former students saying they're doing a lot more. And some have even reached out to me and saying, what can I take from some of the things that have been done at UConn or conversations at UConn, and how can I bring them into the workplace? So people wanting to be advocates in that space. I see Abigail saying somewhat. I see Denise saying yes, very well. So we've got a mix here of responses, and thank you. Thank you to those. I see Lawanda saying, wondering if people feel more or less as if they belong is in quotes, given to the current socio-political climate. Do Bill or Michael, do you want to take that? And I wonder if we can even describe what belonging means. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit difficult, but I'll take a stab at it because I'm on the screen, right? So I think it's interesting, right? I think that there's a couple different aspects of that where you can find sense of belonging in the current socio-political climate by being attached to one movement or another, by identifying more closely with either a political side or some of the social justice movements that are going on right now. And I think that there's a strength in numbers or a sense of belonging that some folks are really feeling to be part of those communities. And there's a lot of them on both sides, right? So I think it's increased a little bit if I'm answering Lawanda's specific question, at least for us, for me.
Beautiful. And thank you all for putting comments into the chat. Denise, I think this question is directed towards Bill and your comment about having a best friend at work. Do you find that there's differences based on age group or other factors maybe that contribute to the notion of friendship or support at work?
Yeah, so while I'm not a researcher in this area, I'm just bringing that up as an anecdotal issue. I'm sure this is a great place to explore, thinking about how this falls along the lines of gender or other identities that, when I have a leading identity. So for instance, for me, a leading identity is my sexual orientation. And so can I feel as though there's someone at work that I can talk to about those types of situations that might come up or that are happening in our society or things of that nature, something that's related to that identity. If I don't, then do I feel like I can belong and feel welcome and feel like I can bring my whole self? And I might have to hide that part of my identity in some way. And this can range in so many different things. I've read information and talked to folks about, not feeling comfortable saying that they have young children, and because they're worried about then perhaps being labeled in a specific way or feeling like that their commitment to the organization might be less than or in some regard. And so they make up some type of excuse as to, I've got just a doctor's appointment. They don't say it's for their child, or they, they're leaving work early for something committed to school. And so they bring up something else. They don't share that much. And so I know lots of people who bond over their children and the joys and pitfalls of that happening. And so that might help people feel a sense of belonging at work if they can bring that part and share that part with them.
Michael, did you want to add or?
No, I agree with Bill. I was looking at some of the comments. I think it's really interesting, some of the comments that are in here, and thank you everyone for putting them in. It's interesting because I think that what we're seeing with the diversity inclusion conversation is it is not as simple. Somebody, I think it was Nancy in North Carolina, it's not as simple. It's not in a world where everything seems to be polarizing, D&I is not necessarily one of two things. There's so many different facets and so many different components. There's intersectionality, and there's issues within the issues. And what's difficult right now is the ability to hold two truths. We haven't really gotten to a place where that's acceptable. So you can be, for instance, you can be against racial injustice and not believe that we should be defunding police. And for a lot of people, those are coupled, and they can't extricate those two different issues from one another. And so, and we aren't really letting people decouple those things. It's either you're one or the other. And I think it's more complicated, certainly more nuanced than that. And so when we get into these conversations, it's often very difficult for us to go beyond a very cursory level or top level of conversation and get into the nuances that are really the important part of this conversation.
Really great point there. And I see some other themes that are coming in talking about adding diversity, but not automatically fostering inclusion. And those of us that work in this space know that those are not the same thing, although you say them in the same breath or the same sentence. So diving kind of into our first, I guess, theme or umbrella, with what muscle groups that we need to build and going beyond the surface level. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that and what that means for you. And I see Samantha and quite a few others have questions about going beyond the surface level. So I'm going to pass it to, well, if any of you want to go first, jump in.
Well, Bill's going first. A couple times I'll jump in on this and just kind of expand. I think we have to get better at holding multiple truths and knowing that they are true in the moment and things are shifting very rapidly. I think what we've gotten into is drawing a hard line as this is my position on a topic, on a theme, on everything from, what should be included in our work environments versus what is not. And I think we've got to get, one of the things that we pride ourselves on at Google when we talk about being googly is dealing with ambiguity. And I think with this, there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of shifts. Something could be happening right now in the news that's going to shift our position on a lot of things. And we've got to be able to be more nimble and be less cemented in our positioning. And more welcome to new information that's going to shift our thinking and our thought process. So I think, as I look at some of the different dimensions of diversity, I see disability listed a couple times, huge opportunities for us to get better in that way in terms of our workforce planning and in terms of making sure that our workplace is accessible in the truest sense of the term. And as we get better at understanding new and different things, what does that mean and how does that shift? I think that there are dimensions around race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, all around there, and many of the facets of diversity and inclusion that we have to get better at holding multiple truths about.
I like this idea of continuous learning, building our capacity, building ourselves. I think we do a really good job of raising awareness, and that's where we stop. We don't figure out how to go beyond that. I know we do this really well in higher education. That's the field I'm in. But I see it all the time in, suicide awareness walks and ALS challenges and, just tons of stuff, particularly in our social media world, of raising awareness. That's a step. That's helping to educate us and build that muscle, if you will. But now, how do we go beyond that? How do we perhaps engage with one another around our differences? How do we learn how to do that? How do we learn how to talk about those things? How do we learn how to dialogue rather than debate, rather than just discuss those things? Those are skill sets that we are capable of engaging with in our personal lives, in our work communities, in our other communities that we might have. But that's something that you have to perhaps continually work on and engage with. And so that's maybe we want to call that cultural competency. Maybe we want to just call that being an inclusive person. Maybe we want to think of that in other ways. But to me, I think we just get stuck at awareness and think, I'm good, I'm done, I don't have to do anything else. But, I can be the most woke, aware person, and until I'm needing to perhaps work with someone who is different than me, who has different identities than me, who is thinking differently than I do, who's had a very different worldview than I do, I'm not going to perhaps know how to engage or learn or connect with that person. I just want to share a brief little story. I will never forget working with an individual who had a very different religious practice than me and very different expectations around gender. And men and women in particular were not supposed to engage with one another. And I, instead of backing away, I leaned into that. I said, let's talk about those things, let's engage. And to me, when we were able to cross the barrier of engaging about our beliefs and in a healthy dialogical approach, I knew that we were able to then work on other just generic work stuff together because we had built that relationship in a way that could help us succeed in our work environment.
Michael, did you want to respond to that? I saw your mouth move, but I didn't know if you, okay.
No, I just saying that that's great. I love that. I love that into it.
Awesome. I see a couple other questions into the chat that kind of go into this, particularly your point about dialogue versus debating. And someone asked, how do we learn to better listen to folks doing the work and get out of their ways while supporting their work? Do you want to take that, Michael?
I think it's a great question. If you have the answer, I've got a lot of people, that I'd love to feed them the answer to. I think that we're all working in this environment and we're all trying to get better. We're all navigating the landscape. I've been doing this for 20 something years and this is a different world. And we're all trying to navigate. I think that, one of the things that I'm particularly biased on is that I believe this is a discipline just like a lot of different work is. I don't go into a financial advisor's office and tell them how to do their job. And, I have a master's in HR and I think, there are a lot of the things that I do touching different elements of HR, but the experience that I've had over the last 20 years in corporate environments, I hate to use the term expert because I don't think we're really experts. We have more experience than others in this space. Affords me a little bit more of insight into how I think these practices should play out. I love, and I started by talking about the passion that a lot of people have brought to this work, especially recently. And a lot of us have been navigating these waters for a long period of time. So I think it's figuring out how you can, we talk all the time about how do you amplify voices? How do you get behind our work? How do you amplify our voices with the resources that you might have at your disposal, whether that's monetarily or your teams, the teams that you direct, and how you can get some energy and effort behind the work that we're trying to execute and have been, quite frankly, without the interest from leadership and resourcing for many, many years. So I think it's really around how do you engage yourself? How do you get, build your muscle while we're, and support our efforts while we're, while you're doing the work as well. So I don't know, Bill, what do you think?
I'm thinking a little bit about the folks who are on this webinar, that the mid-career folks who are most likely in kind of mid-level manager, maybe director level seats or more, or where they are in the piece there, but folks who've been around for a while is what I'm saying. And so sometimes when I squarely in the middle of that myself, and sometimes then I'm leading initiatives or I'm engaged in stuff, and it's hard when you get criticism of like you missed this situation, or you're not doing enough in this area. And so I had to really take a step back and listen myself and say, okay, I'm obviously one person, but I'm looking this through the lens of a white, middle-aged, gay male, cisgendered male who is, perhaps that's jading my view of everything. And so I want to make sure that I'm engaging with people across many different lenses and identities to help figure out what our next steps might be, and also recognize my limitations in that as well. And so I'm wondering and thinking about that in your role as a mid-level manager, or as a director, and those mid-level folks, Are you stopping to take a moment to think about the lenses that you're looking through, and perhaps ensuring that you're maybe taking a breath and say, okay, maybe I'm getting some criticism, maybe I'm getting some, but we're doing this, we're doing that, what are all that other stuff that we did? It's okay to feel kind of icky about that, but also maybe say, I need to listen. This is my time to listen, and take a step back to reevaluate how I'm looking at the situation. I want to acknowledge there's some folks that, we tend to focus a lot on race, sexual orientation types of things. I want to acknowledge there's been, I think, a lot of movement around disability, particularly in our remote age, in universal design, and ensuring that our environments. So for instance, right now, no offense to our panelists or anything like that, but we have no live caption. We have no one who is doing any American Sign Language interpretation here. I don't know if we have that need on the call right now, and I know that UConn values that, and that's important to us, but I think a little bit about, from a universal design, are we adding that element to our pieces? I know we talked about making sure that that's after the fact, so anyone that might be viewing this afterwards has the ability to see closed captioning or be able to participate in this webinar in a different way. But people are starting to think a little bit differently about that stuff. And sometimes there's catalysts like this more remote learning environment that is helping to shape that. Sometimes in my world, a catalyst is a lawsuit, or lawsuits that are happening in other areas, other organizations. And so I don't want to always say an avoidance tactic is the best thing, but if that's a catalyst for us to be able to make change, something that I've been trying to maybe push for a while and say, hey, that organization, that institution is being sued for this issue. Maybe that means we could perhaps make some change around that issue right now on our campus. A few years ago, I remember that happening with websites. There was a bunch of university websites being called out as not inclusive of multiple individuals with disabilities, multiple ways to engage with that. And so everyone was scrambling over one summer to make sure that websites were appropriately organized.
Can I just comment on, because I think you're right about all of this, and as somebody who identifies as an individual with a disability, like, I'm keenly aware of that in my day-to-day personally and professionally, and it's something that we talk about often. The thing that I think is often lost is we've segmented all these things into, it's about race, it's about sexual orientation, it's about disability, and it's really, we've got to find those intersections and understanding how all of these things impact each other. You cannot have a conversation, I think, authentically about religion, about disability, without understanding the way that it is impacted by one's race and by one's gender, or by one's gender, and all the different dimensions. Take religion. Somebody talked about religion a couple times on here. We've spent a lot of time at one of my former companies understanding the role of the Black church in terms of buying patterns, and understanding the role that it has in the community. And so if we continue to kind of bifurcate those things or separate those dimensions, then we aren't really understanding the full individual. And I think it limits our ability to really support and create a sense of belonging. If we ask you to bring the fact that you are Black, but not the fact that the role the Black church plays for you, means that you're only bringing a portion of yourself. So I want us to think more holistically about the human being and all the things that make them who they are, as opposed to asking them, or worse, making them choose which dimension of diversity is most prominent for them. It changes for me day to day, and it changes for most people.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Michael. I think sometimes we don't think about intersectionality that often, particularly when asked, and it is important to recognize. And it's also important to recognize, which identities for you are most salient in different occasions or in different spaces or environments. And there's an interesting TED Talk by Christy Smith. It's called "It's Time to Get Out from Under the Covers." And it talks about the phenomenon or the theory of covering, and kind of what you were talking about earlier in terms of people feeling like they need to cover parts of themselves or intersectional identities of themselves in order to not necessarily assimilate, but to be accepted into a particular space or into a particular environment. And so recognizing that, okay, if you know that people are covering, then what do you do about it? Do you allow them to keep covering and let that be normal? And the answer is most likely no. We want people to be their whole selves, their best selves, their authentic selves in a space. But how do you allow people to bring that out? What are the conversations you need to have? Is it enough to just say, this is a safe space or this is a brave space? What can we do?
I would assume people are covering. People are covering. Yeah.
I think it's also important for us to acknowledge the tax or the toll it takes. You talk about it as covering. We talk about it often as code switching. And the toll, for those of you not familiar with the term, code switching is when I have to show up in different places differently, and I switch who I am based on the audience that I'm in. And I think about folks that never have to worry about it and they just show up, right? And how freeing that must be. There's so many folks that I talk to on a regular basis that talk about when they present to their white male manager, they present one way, and when they're home and when they're with their family and friends, they show up completely different. And as somebody who I think about how much, I'll try to keep this short, but like I code switched most of my middle school years. I'm half Puerto Rican. I went to a school that was half Black and half white. Didn't know who the hell I was. And I spent so much time walking in one hallway one way and the other hallway a different way. And I was exhausted at the end of the day. The tax, the toll, I did terrible in school. And I got to a place several years later where I was like, you know what, I'm just going to be me. And I just remember how liberating that was and how much better I did in school and how much energy I had at the end of the day. And there are people in your offices that go through that every single day. And so how do we expect them to bring their best self or bring their full self if they're spending so much time in exhaustion switching every time they walk into a different environment? So that's really what we're trying to do in terms of free people up, having the conversations to identify so that people know that they can show up as their full self, or we talk about it as their best self. We don't necessarily want everybody's full self, but we want them to bring their best self to work every day or to our environments.
Great, and I see some responses here on the chat talking about how confidence and identification in terms of how the person arrives at work in society can influence that. And also looking at, so thank you, C. Douglas Johnson, for that. And I see another comment that says that seems to approach it from a strengths-based perspective, which both makes sense and improves the view of the management staff while honoring this toll that it takes on mental health, physical health, and et cetera. Yeah, I see you both nodding. So I see a couple themes here. I see Abby's question about how can you remove unconscious bias at work or in personal life? And I feel like people, no matter who you are guilty of having stereotypes, but I guess if you talk about individual bias, or you can lean in a little bit more and look at like a company's cultural or systemic issues that you might have. What do you all have? Do you all have thoughts on how to assess that or address it?
Michael, you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, I guess this is maybe one of the ones where I might differ a little bit. I mean, I think that it's a great question. And I don't believe we're going to eliminate unconscious bias. I think what it is it's how do we make ourselves more aware when it's present in the room, when it's present in our day-to-day interactions, when it's influencing the way that we show up for other people. and navigating away from it. I think the challenge is when we try to pretend that we don't have unconscious bias. We all do. And so this whole idea that we can mitigate all unconscious bias by taking a course, a 45-minute video or whatever, I think is, it's doing us a disservice, both personally and the profession. Because I think what we need to do is identify that it's embedded in a lot of the systems that we're in, a lot of the policies that exist, and a lot of the human interactions that we have. And instead of trying to mitigate for all of it, to navigate it all out of the system, we have to acknowledge it and be able to talk about it more freely, so that then we can interrupt it and act in a more just way.
All of that, I definitely agree. I often find myself in conversations with others and being challenged by those folks because they have different identities than me. And so then it allows me to take a step and reflect back on that and say, is my bias showing? Am I not able to understand the situation because of the way I am looking at the situation? There's a great approach, a flip it to test it, flip it to a different identity. And do you still feel the same way about that? I think we might have lost Stephanie here, Josh. But so Josh, I don't know if you want to.
Yep, taking a look at it.
Okay.
If you guys want to keep going with your point, I'll see if I can track her down.
Keep it on. So thinking about, flipping it. So if, an issue is happening and someone is saying, maybe there's something that's coming up around a religious difference of some sort, and people are dismissing it as it's a nothing issue. And so let's flip it away from religious issues to some other type of identity, racial issues, sexual orientation issues, age concerns. If we flip it to a different thing, does it feel different? Are you able to look at it in a different way and maybe then see it from that other person's perspective? That flip it to test it type of mentality, I think, is helpful for me sometimes to look at it from the other person's perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I'm going to come back to Ben. I'll get to your point, the executive order in a little bit. But staying on this topic for a second, Porter talks about the conscious and overlooked conscious and unconscious discrimination, which I love, because the other thing that we've done is we've created this unconscious bias thing, and that's real, but we've used unconscious bias to cover up for a lot of conscious bias that exists. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to be able to discern the difference between the two and where they show up. And to your point, macro aggressions are real, and they happen, and they exist for a lot of different groups. A great call out on age or generational differences as well. We see that, we hear that a lot at Google and across the tech sector. And some of those are in fact unconscious, but in fact, some of them are conscious. And we've got to figure out ways to kind of discern the difference and be able to call the conscious stuff out on its surface, and be able to call it on to Matt and address it as the discrimination that it can be when it exists.
Just jumping in real quick, Stephanie randomly lost power.
Oh,
so she is attempting right now to log back in on her phone. But where we were going, and thank goodness we have notes that we've all kind of talked about at this point, is that we were heading in the direction of starting to identify the muscle groups. And obviously we kind of got into the unconscious bias piece, which is a necessity. So Michael, I know that this is a big thing that you talked about when we first connected way back when with Google. Can you talk a little bit about some of those areas that you are working on within your own organization to kind of take that step to the next level and give your people the tools that they need to start activating those muscles?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's very difficult when, I've been in, media and entertainment, insurance, and tax and accounting practice, right? Those are three fundamentally different languages to talk about belonging, to talk about inclusion, to talk about othering, and even talking about bias, because they've operating from different frameworks. And so one of the things that we're trying to do as we bring in 125,000 employees is get as many as we can talking using the same language. We can't have cogent conversations if we're talking about things very differently. So aligning on how to talk about what is sense of belonging, what does it mean, what is intersectionality, what does it mean to across different dimensions of diversity, and how are we thinking about bringing folks along? In order for us to have a really robust dialogue that's necessary for us to make some of the changes, we have to get everybody on the same page. And right now we're on very different pages. We've heard and we've seen in the chat people talking about the difference politically on different sides of the spectrum. And you can be on the different sides of the spectrum. And it also helps to bring us closer if we're talking about using the same language. I think what happens is we've weaponized a lot of the language across different sectors and by being on different sides of the spectrum. And we've got to align on what the proper language and what discourse looks like. One of the big ones that I talk about often is around grace and recovery. And so how do you step in it, right? We all know it, we've all done it. How do you step in it and recover? And how do you let people recover? Because that doesn't necessarily make them a bad part of society. It doesn't make them a bad agent. It means that they stepped in it. And in order for us to get better in this process, in order for us to get better as a community, we've got to be able to build the language that allows for slip-ups and recovery. And so that's really one of the things that we're anchoring a lot of the work in, is what is sense of belonging, and then how do we get there, and how do we talk about it with the same outcomes in mind?
Michael, I want to move on a little bit from that piece, or not move on, contribute to the, I really like to hear this idea of like a slip up. So, we have huge examples of people making more than a slip up, years of prejudice or oppressive behaviors that are, warranting that individual stepping down, being removed from that organization, being fired, etc. And so I think the everyday, unfortunately, those everyday little small microaggressions do add up to cause a lot of significant harm. However, I think there's also some small everyday acts of kindness, if you will, or ways that we can perhaps kind of learn from those moments. Working in the higher education community, it's always an educational opportunity for us to say, okay, this is a learning environment. How does someone learn from this mistake that was made? And can they recover in this space, or can we allow that to happen? I think that's a little difficult right now in our cancel culture, but I think I want to give a little space, and it sounds like you want to give a little space for folks to be able to recover from that. I really kind of value that as well, because I think sometimes when people do make a mistake and it's met with the disgruntledness or frustration or whatnot, which I think is warranted in many times, it causes people to back away, to be scared, to shy away. Well, I'm never going to talk about race. I'm never going to bring up this issue again. I'm never going to participate in a diversity conversation or something of that nature. And so I'd rather not have that person run away. I'd rather have them sit and stay and maybe learn from this and engage differently. Those are some skills though to have to figure out and practice. And so how can I, as the person who was maybe offended, be offended, but also be willing to accept and acknowledge that that person can grow and learn? How can I, as the person who maybe said the offensive issue or did the offensive thing, not run away from that and maybe accept all responsibility in that moment and accept my responsibility towards change and improving the harm that I've created? That's a real lot of growth that might have to happen within that organization and that unit. And I think that that's really possible. And there's some great restorative practices that can be done within organizations that I would love to see us do, rather than just kind of cancel and move on. Can we restore in some way? I really appreciate you sharing that, Michael.
Yeah, I love that. I think that the work that a few folks are doing in the restorative justice space, we hear it talked most frequently from in the sexual violence arena. And I think there's a lot of application of the lessons that have been learned there over many years, and a lot of great work in our environments, in other environments, in society, in our corporate environments. We're looking at bringing in more restorative conversations between our, I lead a group, a community, our Black and Latinx marketers. And we're working on some restorative justice components to hopefully help navigate those conversations. Because you're right, it's not about, oh, sorry, I said the wrong thing and moving on. It's like, no, you've done harm, and we have to repair that. And what does that look like for both sides? And how do we bring, how do we give the power? It's also a shift of the power dynamic, right? So how do we shift power back into individuals that were harmed or the target of the language?
Well, Michael, I think one of the things that you mentioned kind of speaks to the unconscious bias piece. And one of the questions that did come in while you were talking about that is, are there efforts to help folks identify and understand the unconscious bias that's there? And how do we make the efforts to call that out and help them to improve? Because again, that's one of those muscle groups that we need to work on individually and understand within our own self-awareness. So what are some of those strategies that you might implement within your own organization? And Bill, I'd say the same to you in the higher ed space. How does that work?
Yeah, I'll give you one in practice. I mean, we have any number of different trainings that we've created over the last couple of years. They're available to the public around unconscious bias and kind of what it is. I think what we're getting better at is understanding where it shows up. So one of the things that we started to incorporate over the last year or so, we go through, and most companies go through some sort of performance review process. And so one of the things that we've done in what we call our calibration, where we sit down and we look at everybody's performance review for the year, is we nominate somebody to be what we call a bias buster. And that person is responsible for just having their antenna up around words that are most often associated with bias. And so if we're talking about words that are gendered or racialized language that we see sometimes in the performance process that usually negatively affects people's performance, that person is responsible for calling them out in real time in a safe way, but also everybody in the room knows that that's what their responsibility is to do in that. So there's no retribution, most of the people are really appreciative to be, we call it called in, as opposed to calling out. Like, we want you to know that you've used this language about women or about a certain ethnic or racial group repeatedly, and it might be impacting the way that you see their performance. And so it's in service of getting us all better and creating a better community. But it's really about how do we identify where it shows up in the system once we've started to raise the level of awareness individually across our ecosystem.
Michael, I wonder if there's ways in which we can not only train, but develop in our supervisors and managers the ability to do some of that thing. So I know that that's a very tricky conversation to have with someone as well. And so not everyone has the skill set to call out bias, to call out oppressive comments, to call out prejudices of those nature. And so are there some ways that we can perhaps enhance, I think there are ways, but ways that we can enhance our supervisors to be able to feel empowered in that way to develop those skills? Or if that is not something that would work within their organization, is there another approach that might be had? I'm not asking you to answer that, but I think that that's something to think about. We often talk about that in our arena. There's an issue that happens with an employee, it's called out as bias. So I'm on the bias incident response team for the colleges. So when we get those types of reports, and then if it's not a violation of our policy, it's not a hate crime, it's kind of falling in this other in-between category as maybe breaking our social code or our expectations within our organization. And so maybe we're trying to have some educational intervention there. Well, who is doing that educational intervention? Who maybe has a strong relationship with that employee to be able to have a deeper conversation that can go past, please don't say this, or please refrain from doing this type of thing when you're in the workplace. To have that be more of a developmental conversation rather than just a don't do this again type of a conversation, which I think is avoidance.
Well, it's funny that you actually raised that. The timing of that is perfect, because the next question in the queue actually falls right into this category. So one of the things that you're talking about, Bill, obviously, is making sure that the conversations can kind of continue and that there's a balance. Well, one of the questions coming in from Denise is asking, how are the conversations with employees balanced between voluntary and mandated? Obviously, you can have a certain expectation or cultural expectation within your organization, but how then can you work to balance the mandated versus voluntary aspects of somebody trying to improve that works for your organization after that?
I'm a big fan of accountability and making sure that that's, so if we are going to be fighting sustained issues of racism and institutionalized issues in our society, we need to have sustained institutionalized approaches. And so how, sometimes I ask people this: when was the last time you had an evaluation by your supervisor? There are many years that I've gone with no shame to my supervisors, but sometimes those things don't always happen. That gets pushed to the side. And so are we ensuring that that's happening? And is it within that system some type of accountability to hold that person into the expectations of that job and that organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion? We talk about that now in a lot of times in the arena of when we hire someone, we're asking them to supply a diversity statement or demonstrate some type of inclusive practices in the classroom or in their work prior to coming to this institution. Okay, so once they're here, what type of practices do we have for their tenure review to ensure that that's still a component of the staff, like myself? Is it a component of my evaluation that I have to be engaging in DE&I efforts? It is. And so how is my supervisor holding me accountable for that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how we increase our accountability measures. I think there's a balance, right? I think that we've got to get folks in the room, not just the ones that are running to the room, but the ones that are somewhat resistant to come. And I think that there's also a couple different levers that you use. There's a lot of, we use, for lack of a better term, peer pressure. We have a lot of folks that, as leaders, they want to be more accountable, they want to be more inclusive, they want to be seen as a destination for our underrepresented talent that moves in our organization. And so when other people that are at their level, see that they're making these strides, there's an embedded kind of peer pressure that pushes them along. We don't have a mandated training. We just now, for the first time, have a brand new mandated training. But for years, it's been really leaning into accountability measures and peer pressure, wanting to be seen as a truly inclusive leader. And I think when you start to demonstrate or hold people accountable that that's what's valued in your organization, people will shift pretty quickly. We like to say that, like, when people will move when they either see the light or feel the heat. Our preference is that we show them the light and they go in that direction. And we found that most people, just when they've seen the light, they will move in that direction, and we try to get them there through that mechanism.
Well, that makes sense. Now you've kind of segued us into another direction of some of the conversation we hope to accomplish today. Obviously, one of the big challenges, like you mentioned, with employees of whatever range of status within the hierarchy of the structure of their organizations, they're all looking to implement change. And you talked about, if you build the expectation of peer accountability, that will also lead to some of that growth and some of the improvement. But what are some other strategies that you might recommend to folks as they're trying to figure out, whether they're entry level, mid-career, senior career, how they're trying to figure out the next step within their own organizations and start to cultivate and establish an inclusive environment? Oh, Stephanie's back. Fantastic. Hang on one second. Let me add you back to the mix here.
Thank you. And my apologies. I lost power briefly. I don't know why. So sincerest apologies. Keep talking. Don't let me stop the flow.
Well, what I was just asking Bill and Michael was the question of providing some strategies for folks, regardless of what level within the organization they might be, to start trying to change some of that culture and creating and helping to cultivate from whatever level they're within of an inclusive environment. Because obviously, depending on what organization they're in, they're at different stages of that. So.
Awesome. And did you all answer already? I'm sorry, just hopping in here. Go ahead. So I think this ties into the building the muscle, developing the capacity theme, or activating the muscle, building that marathon piece. So going beyond, what can you do?
That's it.
So I briefly spoke before about catalysts that might cause change. So for instance, the lawsuit, the fear of being sued for our websites not being compliant or something of that nature. While I think that those are great catalysts for some change, there's some great work by Damon Williams in the Chief Diversity Officer world around that being considered a cheetah moment, meaning a quick kind of a jump to react type of a thing, which I think might be good for some short-term wins. Sometimes we do need, I think, a couple public things of great change and movement on something. But then sometimes I think we get stuck in that, or we say like, well, yeah, but we did this, and now we're just back to our typical process or typical things. So I think that there's value in strategic planning. I think that is a component of this work, and having defined measurable goals that we're trying to make improvement on based on assessing where our organization is and where we'd like to go, and then sticking to that plan, knowing that might need to be fluid throughout that process. My institution right now is in the process of enacting the strategic plan that has been put in place a few years ago, and making sure that we're making good on the path that we laid out, and hopefully then having some key performance indicators to demonstrate growth along that area. I think there's also needing to have a capacity within your organization for this stuff to happen regularly and naturally. So for instance, in my small unit, my office, the amount of conversations that we have on a daily basis related to diversity are through the roof. We talk about this stuff all the time because it's invited. And so that's a culture that's formed, though, in this unit because of our personalities and our identities, and allowing that to happen. And so if that's not something that's occurring naturally within your small unit, within the larger organization, how can we create that? Is there a space on the agenda for us to talk about those things at the weekly meeting? Is there an opportunity for just introducing that in some way, that maybe that's someone that's just taking that step bravely to say, I'd like to add this to the agenda of, this issue that we've been talking about the last 3 weeks. Are we only looking at it through our white lens as, middle-aged white people in the room? And so maybe we need to be thinking about this from a different angle because all of our identities are so similar. And so, maybe that's just a catalyst that's helping to bring about that change. And now that perhaps is something that always then is part of this process. I found when I was the Chief Diversity Officer, my presence at the table sparked those conversations. I didn't even have to bring it up. Someone would kind of, I hated being in the diversity police role. I never wanted to be in that. I did used to joke that I had a rainbow pad of demerits that I would give out, but I never did give out any demerits. But I think about that presence, and so is diversity even at the table? And so when I was at the table, it sparked some of those different conversations, ways of thinking, ways of talking about stuff. There's so many different strategies, but I think it's worth exploring on your individual level what you can maybe do in that your unit that might then have a broader impact within the greater organization.
I love that, Bill. I think that's so important. And for those of us like in this profession, like I love the joke about being the police, right? Like it's unfortunately it's part of the territory. I think another way that I try to approach it is I spend a lot of time with our mid to senior leaders helping them find a more authentic voice in this space. I think that one of the things that we've really inhibited this conversation in part because we've told people it's only about one or two things. And I found that helping folks to find their authentic voice, whatever that may be, is a great entry point into the conversation. And I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with a white male leader a couple of years ago and asked him, like, why we were doing diversity, quote unquote, diversity narratives, which is an exercise we do with senior leaders to identify why they care about this. And he gave me some, quite frankly, it was an awful answer about why race mattered and something that happened in 1993. And I was like, I asked him and probed a little further. And it turns out his wife is an executive director of a major medical organization, and they had moved 3 times to support her career. And I asked him if he was proud of that, and he was like, I won't repeat because Google language is not always appropriate for Zoom calls, but he was really proud of that, right? And so he was like, you know what, I can talk about that. I'm proud of that. I've done that. I believe that we should be doing more of that kind of stuff. And through that, he's become one of our greatest advocates for multiple dimensions of diversity. But it was really about how do you find your authentic voice to enter in a safe way that was safe for him. And through that, he's found other vehicles to get into conversations more authentically and more appropriately about race, about sexual orientation, and about a couple other, about disability as well. And so I spend a lot of my time trying to kind of, there's a question, I know she's not here anymore, from Lawanda about how do you call people in. My best technique for calling people in is finding out what motivates them intrinsically about this work, as opposed to telling them, no, that's what you should care about, when oftentimes that may not be the thing that motivates them into a difficult conversation.
Yeah, that's really great there. And I see that those conversations that you had are really important. And that was what I'm gathering is a verbal, albeit virtual conversation. But I see a question in the Q&A from Kimberly Liang, and I really hope this is my Kimberly Liang. That was a former student of mine. But what are your recommendations on initializing conversations in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice for particularly an entry-level person at a large company? So you might have minimal access to the goal setting or the strategic planning, but like how, the actual how do you, is it an email? Is it, I don't want to dive in too deep myself, but I'll let you answer. I'll start with Michael and then we'll go to Bill.
So it looks like it is your Kimberly Liang. So just catching up on the question. So great question. So you're brand new, you're entry level in a role. If a company brings you in, you have some sort of agency. And I think that it's really important for us to figure out what agency we have. Obviously, as we ascend through a corporation or environment, we likely gain more agency. But I think it's about understanding the agency that we have. I see a lot of entry level or early career folks leaving an environment way too soon because they haven't maximized, they don't like the way, they don't like something. They don't like the way that, they've seen microaggressions or they've seen a policy they don't like, and they can't change that particular policy, but they are leaving so much of their own agency on the table. So I think it's really about, taking a view of your own landscape. I almost guarantee, outside of having a very radical, extreme view, there's other people in your organization that see the same challenges that you see. So aligning yourself with them, finding strength in numbers, but really honing in on like, what can I change about my environment? I mentioned I work with marketing. We have an incredible entry-level program called our APMM program, and I work with 340 of them on a regular basis about how do we change that program, right? And we started doing that 3 years ago. And by changing that program, we've started to have ripple effects all throughout marketing. And it would have been easy for one of them, because they have Google on the resume, they probably went to, you know, one of the top 20 schools in the country or the world, to just be like, screw it, I'm leaving. Because I don't like that one problem. But the ones that chose to stay and get engaged and lean into the agency that they have are having lasting impact. And I think that that's where I would tell you to invest your time and effort. And while you accumulate the organizational capital or equity that you need to change the macro thing.
Beautifully said, Michael. Hey, Bill.
I've been there. I've been the person to say, I'm out because I'm done. I'm tired of the fight. And I need to be the one walking away and collecting myself. And I've also been the person to say, I need to stay because my voice needs to be here. My ideas need to be here. My identities need to be here. It was empowering for me in that moment to make that choice to stay. And it was empowering for me in the moment to make the decision to leave. I think that's an impactful moment for anyone to figure out on their own way. The one thing I will say is, so I can't speak for all chief diversity officers or all people who are leaders in organizations around this, but in that role particularly, I really valued meeting one-on-one with students, meeting one-on-one with new professionals, people who had energy, ideas, enthusiasm, but also fresh eyes coming into that organization. There's many folks that work for many years doing great work, wonderful things, but we are only able to look at something from that perspective. And so a fresh perspective coming in is really helpful. I will never forget having a wonderful conversation. Shout out to Jacqueline Akins, who was a graduate student at SUNY Fredonia, and said, I have a problem with this. Dr. BOERNER, can I talk to you about this? And of course, let's have coffee, let's engage. Sparked opportunities and change that I was not able to focus on because I was looking at things from a different perspective. And so this young woman of color coming in saying there's a problem in this organization that I can see some change. And I welcomed that. Now, I'm not sure if other leaders are able to welcome that level of engagement and conversation. I hope that they might be able to do that. But I would encourage folks in that early career, new professional role, if there's some concerns, some ideas that you have, voice it. You know, there's also some nuance there around relationships and how you voice that and how you perhaps want to engage within what is appropriate at the culture of that organization. Is the culture, to just blurt it up and say, this is a problem, blah, I hate you, probably not, but, is there ways to perhaps navigate and do that? And I know that might involve some code switching and some covering to be able to navigate that stuff. And so I wanted to just name that out loud and acknowledge that I get it, that people have to sometimes do those things to be able to advance in their fields, as well as advance the specific concerns that are going on.
I love that. And just do it particularly to the early career, and also if you're on the receiving end of that, right? So if you are the supervisor or the manager or the colleague, coworker that someone comes to, how do you receive that and how do you react to that? So this kind of goes back to the earlier piece about listening and what do you do? Well, you react, you support, you amplify. And amplify, you might hear that word a lot, but what does that mean? So it might say, if you want to have a Zoom call with everybody or a Google Meets call with everybody and talk about it, and I'll be there with you as a support, I'm here for it. Or if you have a survey of some sort, or you gather that feedback, what do? You need to actually acknowledge the responses that are given, because there's nothing more disheartening than pouring your soul into a survey and nothing happens from it, or it's not even acknowledged or given. So those are things that we can continue. And another point, I see a question into the chat, and you talked about when to know when to stay because you matter, and when to know when to leave. So how do you know when to exit from a situation or an organization where there is no awareness, there is no effort to step one, or it looks like this person is the only female, identifies as brown in an all-male team, so it's affecting mental and physical health? What do you do?
It's it's an age-old question. I think, you know, we all wonder that for different reasons, but you know, I'm in two camps on this one. One is like my gut would be like, you know, if you're asking that question, you've probably been there too long. And I recognize that somebody's gotta sometimes stay in those roles to affect the change that's necessary. And I go back, I've really adopted or learned over the last few years the concept of agency. And I don't mean to beat it to death, but like, I think when your agency has been stripped and you are not seen and you don't feel like the opportunity to be heard, then it's time for you to leave and stop fighting to be seen. But because there's a number of other places that will see you for, you know, the skills, the talent, the person that you are. I think there's opportunity sometimes to stay. And when you realize that, like, sometimes you just need one. You need somebody else to see you and to amplify your voice or to find that sense of camaraderie with. But if you're not seeing that, like, you got to get out, use your network, get out, find other places. Life is too short. Right now is too damn hard to be fighting this on top of everything else, you know, to be seen and to be heard. And I say that recognizing a great amount of privilege to be able to say that. And many folks don't have the ability to do that. So do it thoughtfully and do it carefully. But, you know, start paving your way out if you don't feel like you have agency or that people are actively taking your agency away from you.
Bill, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. It's complicated stuff. Particularly, I know individuals who based on children, based on spousal situations, based on financial circumstances, cannot leave and they're stuck. And so, are there other ways in which you can build affinity groups or find joy in your work in other ways so that that doesn't continue to manifest itself in such a poor way that your mental health and emotional well-being is eradicated? I left when mine was depleted and I had shingles, and I knew that was a sign my body was not able to cope any longer with I had shingles on my face, actually. No longer able to cope with the mental strain that was that organization. And so I knew I needed to save myself in some way and walk away. So complicated stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stephanie, I know we're getting close on time. There's a quick piece in the question, and that was to me directly, that I wanted to just kind of highlight, if you don't mind.
I was just going to sling that to you, so perfect.
Okay, you know, particularly as a white identified person in this space, and I want to recognize and acknowledge that I think if we are going to be inclusive organizations or move our society in an inclusive way, we all need to be there, and this can't rest on the shoulders of minoritized individuals, people of color, people of targeted identities. And yes, I do have some targeted identities, but my white male privilege is oftentimes a leading part of who I am that I cannot disengage from. And so I want to use that. It actually has afforded me opportunities to engage with other people who have that same identity to me and help move this dialogue in a different direction, which I've really valued. And so I think that that's important. I also think it has helped me engage in ways that I never thought I could. And so take some time to engage and learn and participate. And maybe that's individually on your own for a little while until you really feel like you can engage with others across those differences. But this is a space for everyone. And this is a space that we all need to be participating in if this is going to become an inclusive organization, inclusive society.
Yeah, I agree with that, Bill. And sometimes I hear from students who identify or self-identify as white or male saying, I can't do this work, this space isn't for me, I want to give platform to other people. And to your point, no, everybody needs to be doing the work. It's not who should be doing, but how can we all do it? And acknowledging that there is space and ability for everyone. And it's not just one person who should wear the DEI hat or or bring those conversations to the table. Absolutely.
I don't want to take away, sorry to interrupt, I don't want to take away from your experience or speak for you. And so I want to sometimes listen and need to take my seat in the back and sit down and propel others ahead of me, but I'm still participating by doing that.
I think for our last question, I'm going to combine Denise's question and C. Douglas Johnson's question about how to move forward. So Denise in the Q&A talks about responding and continuing the involvement of someone who may be frozen, and you might have emotions that such as anger and frustration. How do you move forward? And C. Douglas acknowledges Michael saying you knew that you wanted to work in this area. What advice do you have for those who want to pursue this type of work but have been discouraged from doing so?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. So the question, yeah, I think that, you know, there's a lot of, it's hard without knowing the specifics of any of these. But I'll say that if you're willing to do the work and you're passionate about doing it and understanding, and you're willing to spend some time listening and, you know, about historical work in this space, I think a lot of the work has been done. Like, we've been doing this for 40 years. And a lot of it's failed. You know, if we're being really honest with ourselves in this space, I hope to be on my second career, you know, by now. And unfortunately, I'll probably be doing this the rest of my life. And I've reconciled that with myself. But, you know, I've done a lot of my history. I've done a lot of research to understand, like, what did Coca-Cola do? And what were some of the things that either corporations or societies have tried in the past to build greater sense of equity and sense of belonging for the organizations and things like that. So I think, you know, there's two things. One, you have to really be honest with yourself about whether you have the capacity to do this. This is not easy work. People call me all the time. They're like, oh, especially now, in the last 5 months, my LinkedIn is off the chains. Like, oh, I want to move into D&I. I'm like, and some of the people I know personally, and I just know that their makeup is not one that they can stay in this long term. This is a long-term effort. We appreciate everybody jumping in and being involved and driving at the thing that they're specifically interested in. But, you know, I tell people often, are you ready for what was my most difficult day in this profession, which was November 9th in 2016, where, as somebody who manages inclusion for a corporation like Google, I have to make space for people to celebrate things that I vehemently oppose. And that's the nature of this work. It's not just about glory, or not that it's glorious, but like, it's not just about the glory days when you open access to a certain thing that you really believe in. It's about the tough days where you are maintaining inclusion and equity for everyone. And that includes folks that sometimes are diametrically opposed from things that you believe in. So I think if that's true for you, then you know, we welcome you, we need you, and happy to work with you and figure out the best way to get into this work. Awesome. Hopefully that helps or answers something.
Final thoughts, Bill, before we hand it back over to Josh?
I value that people can really have a passion about this stuff and be able to then infuse it to whatever work they do. And so you don't necessarily have to be employed in the DEI space to engage in this. I assume that folks on this call today are excited about this, have some interest, want to learn. Whatever role you have, you can help infuse some of these things into it. And I think sometimes that personal passion helps you feel motivated and continue and move things in a positive direction for your organization. And so you all have the capacity to do this work and engage. And I encourage you to seek that out, look for it within your own organizations. And if you can't, create it.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Josh. It's been an honor being on this panel with you, even though I stepped out because of power, but thank you.
Well, first and foremost, thank you to all of you for your time, your expertise, and your energy to this. I've gotten to know all three of you very well through this process. Some of you I've known for a long time. Bill mentioned his time in Res Life, and we actually used to know each other way back then. And Michael, I've gotten to know over the past few years with my travels out to California when you were out in Palo Alto. And Stephanie, it's been an honor and a privilege to get to know you, especially as you indicated, being a triple Husky that you are. I mean, there's so few of you out there. So it's one of those unicorns we find, we're excited to have you. And the fact that we were able to retain you in such an expertise that you bring to the table is such a value to the university. And we're grateful that you are a part of our institution and continue to be. And we can't thank you all enough. We know this is a difficult conversation and you all put your lifeblood into this and it shows. And your expertise is truly valued by all of us within the university, the foundation, as well as from the UConn Nation and the community that we are. So thank you all so much. I know that there are a lot of questions that we didn't necessarily get to and a lot of comments that are still out there. I know that this is an ongoing dialogue that just continues to grow. And I know we spoke in some of our prep calls, but I know that the panelists are willing to continue to engage in this dialogue and conversation with fellow Huskies. So if you would like to be connected with any of them at any time, please reach out to me and then we can facilitate some introductions from there. Again, thank you all to all of you for joining us. A couple of quick things and wrap up. I want to make you aware, we do have a virtual library of all of our offerings that we have been doing virtually throughout the COVID pandemic and the work from home scenario. You can find all of that information at youtube.com/UConn alumni. See, Michael, we have a Google product. Don't worry, we're good. We're maybe on Zoom today. But that, again, that's youtube.com/UConn alumni, and you'll find a variety of offerings and recordings of events that we've held since March, and even beyond that to a certain degree. And this itself will actually find its way up there at the conclusion as well. And you'll also receive a link to that tomorrow as a in your thank you for attending email that you received from us. Additionally, I want to make you aware of a few other events that are coming down the pipeline as well that you can find on our calendar. You can always find that by going to our events calendar on our Husky Hub. First and foremost, tomorrow we have the last in our Welcome to the Neighborhood series, where we're going to be talking to folks that might be interested in moving to Philadelphia. We have a panel of folks that are living in the Philadelphia area, part of our alumni network there, that'll talk about all the ins and outs you need to know before moving to Philly. On November 2nd, we have part of our mindfulness and wellness series. We have a mindful wellness workshop where we have one of our Boston Alumni Network leaders is going to be leading us in some different aspects there. So you can sign up online. November 9th, we have the next episode in our 1881 series, What's on Tap, where we're going to be talking about all of our alumni-owned breweries, one of which is actually working to infuse cannabis into beer. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and the trends that are happening across the country and what they're doing to help pave the way. And then finally, we are now back in the Big East. I know many people are excited about that. So we are actually partnering with all of our other alumni institutions from the Big East to host virtual networking nights in 6 of our larger cities. The first of which will be kicking off in New York City on November 10th, along with Los Angeles on the same day. And then a variety of those over the next 2 weeks. So you can find all of those by visiting our online website. Want to thank our panelists again, and thank you all for taking time to spend with us today. We know you have a million things that you can be doing, and signing into one more virtual meeting is always one of those things that seems to be a little bit of a challenge. So we thank you all so much, and we look forward to having you join us for our upcoming sessions and virtual events as we move forward. Stay safe, stay healthy, and to our panelists, thanks again for joining us. We'll talk to everyone soon.